I'm going to show you how to validate a workflow through the Orchestrator REST API. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. In the previous few videos, we've been taking a look at how to run an Orchestrator workflow through the Orchestrator REST API. In this video, we're going to turn our attention to something slightly different. What we're going to be looking at is how to validate a workflow through the API. Let's take a look at that in the lab environment. You'll recognize these four workflows. These are the simple little workflows that we've been looking at in the previous few videos. Well, we're going to turn our attention again to the Hello World workflow for this video. Before you run a workflow, it's always a good idea to click Validate to see if that workflow is valid. So let's do so. I click Validate, and as you can see, it says that the workflow has validated successfully. But what if you wanted to do that through the Orchestrator server's REST API? What if you wanted to programmatically validate this workflow? Well, to do that, let's go over to Postman. And in Postman, first of all, we're going to go make certain that we're pointing to the right workflow. So we don't want to point to hello, hello, hello. We want to point to the workflow called Hello World. We'll save that change. You know the drill. We're going to go to get workflow ID by workflow name. We're going to run that by sending the REST request. And it looks like everything's working fine. We can double check that. One way we could do that is to go check this here. That workflow ends in 22 Charlie 2, which I happen to remember is the Hello World workflow. All right, so nothing new so far. Here's where we're going to do something different. We're going to take a look at this REST request called Validate Workflow. Take a moment to examine the endpoint URL. With this REST request, there's nothing fancy in terms of parameters or authorization or headers or even body. We don't need a body at all. All you need to do to validate a workflow through this REST server is use this endpoint URL, make certain that you've got the workflow ID in this variable. When you send the request, let's take a look at what we get back. Well, I got back a 200, and the fairly simplistic response body that we see here says messages, nothing. Now, when there's no validation errors, the response that you get back is very straightforward and pretty boring. So what we're going to do is go break the workflow. So let's go back to Orchestrator. We could break the workflow in many ways. Trust me, I know lots of ways to break my workflows. But what we're going to do to break this workflow is, why don't we break it by deleting this endpoint? That is no longer a valid workflow. We can see that here in the Orchestrator client. If we validate this workflow, notice that it tells us, oh, we've got an error here. The object called say hello does not have a following end schema element, which we know because we just deleted it. And it gives us some idea here of how to fix it, but this is the message that we see in the Orchestrator client. But what about over in Postman? What if we send this same get validate workflow REST request? Let's see what happens this time. Same workflow, so I don't need to change the workflow ID. We're just going to click send. Notice what we get back is exactly the same because I have not saved the workflow. So if you're following along, make sure you go back to Orchestrator and remember to save the changes. So now I have a workflow that's invalid and has been saved. If we go back to Postman one more time and click send, notice that this time our messages property in the response is not blank. Instead, it contains the same information that we saw in the Orchestrator client. So these different pieces of information that we are accustomed to seeing here in the Orchestrator client show up in the REST response as properties of this JSON formatted response body. So that's a quick look at how to validate. I just like to end this video by pointing out why you might want to use this REST request. Why would I do this? Why would I do Postman to validate a workflow when I can just go to the Orchestrator client and validate here? Well, one scenario where you might want to make use of this REST request is in situations where you and your colleagues are all working together cooperatively to develop workflows, and as workflows are being propagated from your test dev environment into production, we don't want to take one of our colleagues' workflows and just blindly push it into the production orchestrator server. There could be problems with that workflow. So what we'll do when our colleague says that they've got a workflow that's ready to be checked in and pushed up into the production orchestrator server, what we're going to do is use a program that we write. I don't think we would use Postman to do this. We'd create a program using the techniques that we've been learning here using Postman, but we'd create a program that acts as a REST client that uses this type of REST request. So use that endpoint URL to validate the workflow, to make certain that the workflow is valid before we push it up into the production orchestrator server. In fact, what I'd probably do is run that newfangled REST client program that we write against all of that colleagues' workflows, because if there's anything wrong with one of them, there's probably something wrong with more than one of those workflows, and it'd be a good idea to just check all of their workflows to make certain that they're perfect, by which I mean valid, before we push them into the production orchestrator server. Join me in the next video as we continue to explore the Orchestrator REST API.